So welcome everyone. Sorry about the venue change. So today we've got the pleasure of having Michael Jacobson present to us. So Michael, of course, as many of you know, is a professor here in the school. Has been doing work in the learning sciences for quite some time now, has many diverse interests within that, ranging from complex systems theories, and I'm sure you might mention in a couple of papers today, and more recently work around things like productive failure and a whole bunch of different innovative learning approaches that can be supported by technologies. Of course, Michael owns his own education technology company as well, Palace Advanced Learning Systems. So today, well, I'll let you introduce it, but we'll be presenting a talk titled Toward Research Publications that Answer Right Questions. So,
Thank you. All right, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me say, if you feel like you want some coffee or whatever, it won't bother me if you get up and go get some. So we can make this, doesn't have to be horribly formal. And so please feel free to ask questions. Or to make comments. This notion of research about answering right questions is a phrase that came from a paper by Jim Greeno, one of our more illustrious cognitive and learning scientists, commenting, kind of making an advocacy for the I might say the superiority of situated perspectives, theoretical perspectives on learning. But I quite like that phrase, and so I stuck it in my title. This is also a talk it started out in 2015 as an invited keynote talk at Hong Kong University. They had a two-day research fest, something like that, for postgraduate students there, and they even have money to fly me over the Great Water to be a keynote speaker at the event. And it was really quite it was a packed auditorium with a lot of research students, as you might imagine there, and so on, and I was quite gratified by some of the comments and so on that I had. So, well, so I kind of built on that. I actually warmed up for the latest version of this last week, I guess the week before, when I was at Beijing Normal University. We've started a collaborative project with the group there between my current ARC Discovery project and then a research group there involved with learning analytics. And so very excited to be using some of our virtual kind of AI and virtual reality systems we've been developing in the new grant and being able to collect data in two Beijing schools. So anyway, we'll kind of talk about publications and right questions, because everybody's always worried about publications. And then maybe have some examples of what those might be. And then I thought I would use a kind of a case study that I happen to know about, because it involves a couple of my papers around this cognitive situative debate. And then we'll kind of end with a story and some time for reflections. But I guess first I want to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes for you folks to discuss with a neighbor, getting published. What are the right questions to help you get published? Do research questions really matter for being published? And if so, why or how? And if you don't really think that you need it, then that's another perspective. So take a couple minutes to talk to your neighbor, and then we'll kind of share as a group and then launch into the actual talk itself. Okay. It's also a good way to know your neighbor too.
right. Yeah, and I guess like related to that, in a way, writing publications that answer right questions means doing research analysis, right? So it starts when you start with research, like in our case,
question that hasn't been answered before, or
wondering something that is
answering a question, or trying to answer a question maybe in a different way. I guess if it's a call for a special issue, one of the questions they put out there. I was thinking at the Learning Outcomes conference, there were a lot of issues that were being raised that seemed quite similar. So questions that related to the current issues in the field. So I guess you could get ideas of questions from attending conferences and things like that.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's like always a process. Like I think you got to start with like some simple research and like over the time, like as I'm sure you put through one of the PhD as I said, like you kind of like go in change and morph.
Okay, so maybe give you 1 minute for each of the groups to kind of distill your insights about this, and then we'll share.
So I guess right questions again, hinges on understanding what the problems actually are, and like to maybe help make progress or solve
The question would really be in the journal.
in a way what
What are the implications to the field? How are you going to commercialise the world with your PhD project?
Not exactly, but I mean, I agree with kind of what you're doing because
I guess it has to be really forward thinking.
definitely, I'm sure, like, and I see it as
Old head in the camera.
washy,
I don't think so.
like, less thing, but like, again, much more reading you do.
No, you're right.
Okay, so maybe we'll share some of the thoughts that folks have. Which group would want to go first? Suddenly,
Well, I
the room
guess-
is silent. Courtney?
So I don't know, like, we're just discussing like answering right questions, right? Like in a way, like maybe it seems like simple. It's like to do with really understanding in a way what the problems in the field are, and so like from the perspective of like PhD students, as we were just discussing, you start out with a far less defined kind of, I guess, question which might turn into a research paper, but as you sort of understand more about the field, you have a better idea of what the problems actually are and maybe some ways to reframe or make progress towards them. So.
Okay, so some aspects of things that seem personally of interest as well as things in the field. How about another group? Things you were talking about in terms of research questions, whether they're right or wrong ones.
So we were discussing, like, if you're aiming for a specific journal or a specific conference, asking questions that are relevant to them. Obviously, there's certain questions that are more relevant to some journals than others. So really trying to situate your question so it aligns with maybe also the thinking and the perspective of that journal or conference.
Okay, and then I think also around, particular journals are really communities of practice in terms of researchers, How about one more group? Who else might want to share?
We talked a little bit about connecting with things that are in public interest as well. I work in the field of masculinities and education research, and that at the moment is really taken up by those ideas are really interesting in general public discourse, and so for that reason there's more people turning to masculinities research who would never have looked into it before, and I think a big uptake of research and increased funding and that sort of thing because of that.
Okay. Well, I think these are, for free group, I'm sure the others, you folks had some nice ideas too, but I think that these, kind of hit some good perspectives, some things about fields of research, academic kinds of things that might relate to policy or more social related, things that relate to personal interests that we have. I think those are all going to be aspects of the kinds of questions that might, kinds of ways you might be thinking about the kinds of questions you would be wanting to ask in terms of being a researcher. Now, but it's amazing how much when I talk to early career people and PhD students and stuff, people just, they think, I gotta get published, I need to get papers before I get out, and, it's just publish, and it's just this obsession. And, and in a way you can kind of say, well, getting published really is kind of a mechanical thing. You write a paper, because you can't get published if you don't have a paper, so you gotta write that stupid thing. You're gonna send it into a conference or a journal. You're gonna celebrate if it gets accepted. You're clearly not gonna celebrate if it doesn't get accepted, so I didn't check that. Although you might drink anyway to drown your sorrows, so I've been there. We can have an excuse to have a drink at either one of those, I guess, depending on what you like to sip. You're going to read the reviews, and then maybe you'll curse them that they didn't get what you were writing about, and they're stupid and blah blah blah. And I've been that way too. But you're going to revise the thing probably, and either resubmit it, or then you might move on and just say maybe what I'm doing just is hopeless, and I'm going to write another paper. I really have run into a lot of people that think that I'm doing these papers so I can get a job or so I can keep a job, and and how hard it is, and it's everybody's so busy, and listen, we in there too. But of course, the right answer, I would suggest anyway, is that we're trying to generate new knowledge or generate relevant knowledge about things that we may not understand. You're going to be contributing to your field, whatever that is. We're broadly in the social sciences related to education and learning. But in doing this, in the generation of new knowledge, that's going to help you get and keep the academic position. But at the core of being able to generate the new knowledge is how do you frame what it is you're going to be doing research about. Now, this kind of right question thing, this actually was builds on a talk that Peter Ryman gave. Actually, I think I stole his slides just before I went to Hong Kong, and on the flight over, I, revised them a little bit, and I give full credit. So the next little bit really is from Peter's excellent talk, and he goes into a little bit more detail on some of these things. And he was calling this Mind the Gap, how to come up with interesting research questions, and it's and he was friending a paper. I don't know, has he actually finished it and gotten it published? I don't know. It's but anyway, why do we care? Well, generate new knowledge. Our research questions can help us get research funding too. Proposals are going to have research questions, and of course, helping us get the papers published down the road. Now, as with many things in the academic world, you can have research questions about research questions, and so there's a couple of folks that Peter had tracked down, and I will confess I haven't read their papers. I just adapted Peter's slides, but I trust him as being very, very thorough about what he did. But I found this fascinating, that more than half of the papers found by this Dillon, back in '83, half of them, educational papers, didn't even have a research question. How about that, huh? Okay, we go, a couple decades later, Bordage, looking at, in the medical research. You would think medical research, it's going to be rigorous and stuff. Nope, about 50% don't have research questions either. And we get even a little bit closer. Things still not changing. White in 2013. So if you're even just thinking of a research question, you're ahead of 50% of the pack. But of the people that do have research questions, how might you characterize them? And what research questions might be associated with papers that have more impact? And I guess you could say what kind of research questions would not have so much impact, because that is another thing. It's really not just that you published a paper. It's that other people are going to find it valuable and they're going to cite it. And they're going to look you up in Google Scholar and you're going to see the counts. And, if you publish 50 papers that have 2 citations each, that doesn't look so good when you're going after a job. Now according to these 2 papers that Peter had referenced, there's kind of 3 strategies or kind of approaches for the research questions. Looking for confusion. The areas that previous research it's kind of looked at it, but maybe there's some contradictions in that evidence, and so you're going to go in there and settle that. Neglect. Maybe some folks just missed. There's a whole big important area, and you're going to look at that important area. Okay, fair enough. Application spotting. There's a lack of sufficient theory. That's how they were characterizing. There might be methodological problems in there, so there's some, maybe there's a need for some theorizing about issues in debate. So now, some examples, and by the way, if there is interest, I'm happy to share these slides if you care. But, for confusion, you'll get something like, more specifically, the current study explores 2 potential explanations for the conflicting results reported in, and then blah, blah, blah. Okay, fair enough. It's in the literature. There's some conflicting stuff. You're going to look at it. Somebody got that published. These are all from published papers. Neglect. However, little is known about how much background information, particularly information about how scientists struggle, influences students' learning. Okay. Just like a child's been neglected and you're going to help that child, this particular area has been neglected and you're going to be the one to come in. Neglecting factors. Okay, this is kind of another one. While the body of research provides substantial evidence for negative association between preschool, underactive, and overactive problem behavior, further research is needed. Okay, so you're going to go in there and you're going to kind of take care of this fact that there's some other factors, some other things need to be attended to. But what has come out in these couple of papers that Peter was looking at, which I actually found quite interesting, is a look at what seemed to be the characteristic of the influential, the highly cited papers, the seminal papers. And instead of these other strategies I referred to, they tend to make a problem out of it. Okay? The central goal of such a problematization is to, I always find that word tricky, I don't know why it is, problematization, is to try to disrupt the reproduction and the continuation of an institutionalized line of reasoning. It means taking something that is commonly seen as good or natural and turning it into something problematic. Okay, well that kind of puts things in a very different way. It's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with filling gaps of various types or neglected areas and so on, but the argument here is that if you're looking at the papers that really get cited and get into the top journals, they're going to be more along the lines of ones that are framing particular problems. So if you're going to be coming up with research questions that are about problems, well, what are they? Well, how and why questions are a good place to start. How and why is going to get you thinking about mechanisms that might be relevant. Research always finds out a bunch of stuff. You describe things, we've got quantitative stuff if you're qualitative research. But how and why is what's important, not just to have a chronicle of some things. I mean, the paper that's going to be looking at mechanisms is going to be a much stronger paper. I like this, the for whom questions, for whom the bell tolls, if you're into literature and American writers. But with that, here's a type of question that would be kind of where the researcher is looking at context, because context can matter a lot. And if you misunderstand the context and you're just looking at something that's in it, then you might be missing some very important aspects of the phenomena that you're trying to understand. So a for whom question, the folks that Peter was citing here would suggest are often found in highly cited influential papers. I like this one, deep questions, all right? Observable events and activities are not necessarily identical with the reasons and causes. And, that's a real issue with both things, and with quantitative and qualitative. We get certain findings, and that might be statistically significant, or we're describing something qualitatively, and it might seem interesting, and that's good, and that has to be reported. But you need to be able to distinguish what are the underlying reasons and causal. Again, this gets back into the notion of mechanisms. And I would suggest that the characteristic of a research question that's probably not at the core of influential seminal papers are what questions? Because that's going to tend to drive you into describing, depending whatever methods that you have, simple things that are observed, maybe simple causal relationships, and they're not really going to be getting into what might be more deeper, more relevant to really understanding what's going on. Okay. Now, people love to write what questions. I'm guilty as charged too. It's just like your brain wants to say what is the influence of learning in a 3D virtual reality environment? But instead of a what question, what is the effect of teaching group facilitation skills on the amount of students' exploratory talk? Well, again, you could ask that, and you could probably find something like that. A way to maybe turn that into a how or why would be, how do activities of a facilitator lead to more opportunities for quality contributions to group talk? Why do group norms reinforce individual contributions? So there's nothing necessarily, as you're initially coming up with research ideas, if a what thing pops out of your brain first. But if you catch yourself, before you put it into your thesis proposal and it's going to go off to your examiners, you want to catch it and maybe try and do this little trick. And another really strong tip, and this was clearly Peter's contribution, not just the not just the kind of summary of the findings in the literature that he was looking at, but this notion that you don't want to end your research with descriptions. You're going to start from descriptions, but you don't want to end with them, okay? Now, sometimes you're going to get findings that you expected, and sometimes you're going to get findings that you didn't expect. Boy, have I had a lot of findings that I didn't expect. But I was able to almost always, really push myself in my thinking as to why I got that unexpected. So it's not that you had a hypothesis and then you were wrong. You had a hypothesis and maybe a good reason why you thought things would turn out a certain way, but it didn't. Okay, well, if you did a good, carefully, designed study and so on, the reason why it didn't turn out is what's important. And your theorizing, your explanations of why it turned out differently, give you a chance at maybe salvaging something that you might initially have thought, oh my God, I'm really, and you can put in whatever word of desperation you want at the end of that. But yeah, maybe there's a mechanism that hadn't been understood, hadn't been identified. Then in your analysis, in your discussion, then you're going to be putting that out there. That's good. That's making an intellectual contribution. And again, if you've identified a particular mechanism, to understand, for whom it applies, in what ways, in what contexts, these are also important things as a researcher that you might be able to get information on and so on. But in Peter's talk, I'm pretty sure he ended with this, for the great research questions, theory is your friend. Okay? Now, with that, there are a lot of theories out there. I mean, theories are explanations that we have in our various areas of scientific inquiry that allow us to have explanations. How or why do things turn out? Why might they be important? But just because you picked out a theory still doesn't necessarily mean you're totally home free. So really examining critically and deeply the kind of theorizing you're selecting to inform the research questions that you're doing is a critical thing. Now, this is sort of then Peter's got some papers. So, like I said, if you're interested in this, I'll send you the slides and you can have a look at some. Are there some questions and comments at this point? Because next was going to kind of go into the case study where I ripped myself apart a little bit and hopefully put myself back together. Yeah, of course.
I guess just one quick comment. So all this discussion about what makes an impactful paper and so on, it is very valuable. I guess just to look at another side of that as well, though. could it potentially be problematic exclusively pursuing these types of papers? I mean, in the sense that, like, you know, in the literature, there's this documented, say, bias towards like positive results, and like, for example, like, you know, a lot of like studies, like, you know, if you don't get a significant effect, it doesn't get reported, so this contributes to this kind of like reproducibility problem, and kind of like this idea that, like, if you're doing, say, a replication paper, which is never going to be like the most impactful thing unless you're like tearing down a big kind of theory maybe, but like could some of these kind of processes or like ideas like be problematic in the sense they might disincentivize people from doing, like, say, more just replication study or something like this?
You know, I mean, it's a real issue we have in the field. You know, in psychology, you know, what's the number? Maybe, I don't know, 20% of the, a lot of the highly, you know, things that are in textbooks actually have been replicated. So it means 80% or whatever the exact number is, I forget. You know, I would suggest probably in educational research, it's lower. and so that's a real issue. You know, some of the work that I'm involved with, you know, we've been able to, over a period of time, start to be able to demonstrate, you know, replication. But the, it's kind of a danger. I think that if you're a PhD student and you're doing just a replication study, that's fine, you know, get it done. You know, then it contributes to, well, yep, we sure were able to replicate that, and this is an important thing, so that's fine. You're going to get your PhD, and you'll probably be able to get that published in a lower ranked journal. I mean, I'm just saying that's probably how that would go. To do a replication study, though, that might kind of extend or push into some kind of a different, maybe it's a different domain. Maybe it's you know, where you might have to be bringing in some other theorizing in order to justify that. Then you're kind of contributing to this issue about replication, but you're also then using that as an opportunity to build or expand upon the literature and what you might think and hope would be a nice area. So yeah, but I think that's going to be an issue that just people are going to have to think about. Yeah. Any other comments or questions at this point? Okay, let's launch ahead.
Can I just ask, do you
Sure.
have any thoughts on why there is such a lack of research questions in the journal articles? If you were saying that from Peter's findings, so the journal articles are talking about only 30% having research questions. Do you think there's a reason behind that?
You know, since I didn't read the papers that did that, my hunch, though, would be that it's probably papers that are getting published in less highly, you know, ranked journals where you might be able to get away with that.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I've been an associate editor at the Journal of the Learning Sciences and editorial board and the National Journal of Computer Supported Collaborative Learning, and I do reviewing for educational psychologists, which is the top ranked journal. And I've never seen a paper that didn't kind of make real clear what the objective was. If it's a, you know, it's a theory paper, then it's, you're framing what you're talking about in a slightly different way. But yeah, I haven't really seen it in the kind of journals that I read and so on. But it is kind of a shocking statistic.
I guess
I know, yeah, because you were an editor out of instructional science.
I guess it kind of comes down to how implicit the research questions are, or whether they're framed as questions or aims or objectives. I think for pretty much anything that gets published, at least in a reputable journal, you could read it and say, well, what was the aim of this? It may not be stated terribly explicitly by the author, and I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. There's usually some notion. And so I think it depends a little bit on how mechanically you do the kind of front-end analysis that allows you to say this paper has research questions. So you think of, you know, essay papers in areas like educational philosophy and so on. You would very rarely pose things in terms of RQ. Some of those are very highly semantic things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I do think if you're into the kind of writing of grant proposals and that kind of thing, well, you're trying to get money, and you probably better be explicit, both about the aim, the overall aims, as well as specific research questions that you're going to be going after, and then what the expected contributions are going to be. It's for more theoretically oriented papers and perhaps some qualitative areas. It might be more exploratory what's being done, and so it's not may not. So take some of these as kind of general recommendations rather than kind of an ironclad kind of thing you gotta beat your head over. Okay. Let's see if it'll come back to life. All right. Now I know it's probably hard to see this, but what I thought I would do is take as an example of publication that I've been involved with, actually with Peter Ryman as co-author, as well as Manu Kapoor. This paper, Conceptualizing Debates in Learning and Educational Research Towards a Complex Systems Conceptual Framework of Learning. This was published in Educational Psychologist in 2016. It received the Outstanding Paper Award from Educational Psychologist last year, so we were very, very honored about that. And what I thought I would maybe do with this is to kind of both share what we were, kind of the problem that we were trying to kind of go after, but as well as some of the reviews that we got, which some of them were painful when I initially read them. The context of this paper actually goes back almost a decade. I met Manu Kapoor when he was a freshly minted PhD student, just had graduated from the Columbia Teachers College, and we hired him at the Learning Sciences Lab in Singapore in 2006. And he was just hatching his notion of productive failure, but he also was really into complex systems, and so, worked out well. And we've been collaborating, been good friends ever since, including kind of precursor conference papers and submissions around this one over a multi-year period. But one thing that really had been of interest to me professionally was this debate between what Andy DeSessa has called fault lines in education and learning research. And this relates to what, in terms of theorizing, what is sort of the kind of core of the theorizing that you're using to inform the studies that you're doing? And you had the paper in 1993, Cognitive Science. Norman was the editor, that first kind of brought out that there's a really big difference between how folks who come out of a kind of a cognitive science, cognitive psychology way of looking at an individual and cognitive processes, and that's sort of the level of theorizing that you're going to be doing in your research, versus folks that are more oriented towards what has been called situated cognition or situativity. We, in the paper, kind of say there's a real family resemblance, though, between situative perspectives and sociocultural perspectives and like that. But basically, you're looking at sort of people and groups as sort of the important. That's the most important level, if you will. And then from that, you'll be able to understand dynamics, processes, practices, and so on that will be influenced in shaping how individuals will be behaving. From a cognitive perspective, groups are made of a bunch of people, so if we understand the cognitive stuff, that's going to inform how people are going to be behaving, and then that also will give us insights into how people in groups will be behaving as well. And this has been a pretty bruising debate. It's been a debate that's been ongoing for about a quarter of a century. And it's been a debate that really the field of educational research has not been able to resolve. It's not just that we had the initial paper coming out in '93, but there are a number of special issues kind of leaped from cognitive science into special issues that were in Educational Researcher, one of the top journals in the field, Journal of the American Educational Research Association. And you had Jim Greeno being sort of the primary person advocating for situative perspectives, which is interesting because he's a cognitive psychologist in terms of his training and his initial work. And then this is Herb Simon and then Anderson Redder. So we had people that were really very, very much cognitive scientists, cognitive psychologists, cognitively oriented researchers. Now, what has happened, though, is that essentially because of the theoretical differences that you have, people tend to use particular kinds of methodologies. The cognitive folks tend to use more quantitative types of methods. The situative ones tend to be using qualitative methods, and that's fine. There's nothing, I use both methods myself. I tend to do kind of a blended thing. But by having different theorizing, which is our explanation of phenomena, and using different methods, and then often having different journals in which things are published, we've essentially had a situation for about a quarter of a century where it's ships passing in the night. We ignore each other. And because we're getting published, it's good, So if you're in a top journal that's more publishing more situative and sociocultural kind of things and so on, well, you're getting published and there's a community that's citing your work and that's good. Meanwhile, you're more cognitively oriented. And you're there and they're citing your stuff and you're feeling good about that. So in terms of ticking boxes that you need to tick as an academic, which is you do have to get published. That publish or perish thing is true. What you're trying to decide is what it is that you're going to publish and whether how it's going to be contributed. But that we've had this debate that the field has not been able to go beyond is something that just really, when I first read the special issue in 1993, I was reading on a plane to a conference in Taiwan, and the kind of the organizer of the special issue in cognitive science was one of the keynote speakers, and and I spoke to him about this really, really fascinating issue and so on, and said that he didn't expect it to come out. He thought it was going to be an issue that kind of brought the different camps together, and it turned out to be one that found a fault line and fractured the field from that point, one might say. So I personally found this of real interest. Now, that's 93. I started drinking the Kool-Aid of complex systems about 1994. And, and it was probably about a decade later. Well, I guess I already kind of went through that. It's kind of like people got tired of debating it, and it just was kind of sitting there. Now, in 2014, with Manu, Peter Lyman, we wrote a paper where we basically making an advocacy for the potential of complex systems perspectives to help. Essentially, we were trying to create a problem out of this debate. And the analysis of the papers in that debate, which are for the paper, are that your cognitive folks tend to look at the individual, the level of individual cognition, and social secondary. Here, as I was sort of referring before, the level is the social, and then the individual cognition is secondary. Essentially, each camp is saying our theoretical perspective is more important than anybody else's. So it's an advocacy from the analysis that we did of which level has got primacy. So neither side is saying the other is wrong. They're just saying our view is more important. And so then you guys can go up and do your stuff too. That's fine. Now, in terms of the complex systems perspective that we advocated, what we're now calling a complex systems conceptual framework for learning, we argue that there are no sufficient arguments nor empirical warrants for theoretical primacy of either theoretical perspective. And the reason that we kind of go to the mat on this one is that if you're looking at systems, whatever kind of complex system you want to look at, a complex biological system, complex chemical system, complex social systems, a complex educational system, you do in fact have levels in the system. You've got micro level, meso level, macro levels. And the interactions that you have at one level, initially, they're all going to kind of start from a micro level. You've got elements or agents that you have in a system. They're interacting with each other based on certain rules or properties. And through those interactions, in combination with dynamics that lead feedback often, that lead to self-organization, patterns that form in the particular system, you then start to see patterns that emerge not just at the particular level, say the micro level, you also see patterns that emerge at a macro level. Favorite example that some of you have heard me use is if you're looking at imagine you're looking at a traffic jam from a helicopter or a drone looking down, and you see a bunch of cars, and the cars speed up and slow down, speed up and slow down. But the cars are going in one direction, okay? But if you're looking down and there are enough cars, you're probably going to see some clumps emerge. And if there's enough, it's going to be a traffic jam. And so then I ask people, which way does that traffic jam move? And if you think about it hard enough, you realize that it doesn't go forward. The jam actually propagates backwards. You know, this car's got a car here, this car's speeding up on it, and it's getting pretty close and slows down. And then the one behind it gets close to that one, and so the clump starts to propagate backwards. Well, there's nothing about the cars that are the elements of that system, which are moving forward. There's nothing about them going backwards. The property of backwardness emerges out of emerges at this macro level from the interactions you have at the micro level. Now, once something emerges at that macro level, it actually does often influence the behavior at the micro level. So once that jam has happened, then somebody else coming up is running into the jam, which is going backwards. So, so essentially, at least to me, that kind of an example shows that you can't say which is more important. Looking at the traffic jam in terms of, looking at the traffic flow in terms of the jam, or looking at traffic in terms of the behavior of the individual elements, they're both important. One of the people who shaped my thinking about complex systems quite a bit is Yaneer Bar-Yam, a condensed matter physicist who was from MIT, and then he formed the New England Complex Systems Institute. And I had the great pleasure of being able to work with him on some conferences and such. He gave a talk at an NSF-funded grant that I was part of with his group. And when he was talking about complex systems, he said, a lot of people look at a system in terms of the trees. So that would be, of course, your micro level. And other people might be looking at the forest, and that would be your macro level. But a complex system scientist is going to be looking at forest trees. You're going to be oscillating your kind of theoretical way of thinking across the different levels of the system. But again, that's sort of a digression that we argue in our paper that you can't assume that a cognitive or a situative perspective have a superior warrant over the other. Now, it sends out reviews, and so this one, now this was a review of the conference paper. First had it published in the International Conference of the Learning Sciences in, I guess that was at Boulder, Colorado. So anyway, got 27 out of 36. This paper is really well written. I strongly appreciate the perspective from which the authors address the existent literature on learning. I found particularly convincing the arguments used to support the thesis that the perspective of complexity is a promising way to achieve a theoretical rapprochement within the cognitive versus situative learning debate. Okay, so I got that far and I'm going, yeah. A real new advancement would be provided if a real theory were built. This is to say, this is said to be the main goal of the work, but so far what is called a nascent theory in that earlier paper is only sort of an epistemological framework which can orient work. Bam, we got slammed down. I however think that this goal is very important, and I would like to strongly support the authors to continue, proceed with their work. Okay, well, anyway. Now here we got a 36 out of 36. All right, so this was a particularly thrilling one. A thorough and compelling foundational paper positing the CSTL, what we were calling it back then, a nascent framework of analysis and design in the learning sciences. The paper is both thought-provoking and critically positioned within the contemporary design research in education. Okay. The reviewer particularly enjoyed and found insightful the multi-scale framework proposes an emergent model for undertaking complex and challenging design analysis and research. Now, we actually hadn't been talking about design in the paper, but this person picked up on design stuff, which is fine. Some further simplification for how it could be used in different educational settings would help to enhance the submission. Okay, it's a journal paper, obviously it's a conference paper, so it's short. And so that gave us some confidence to send it off to educational psychologists. Okay, well, we went through 3 really bruising reviews. We really just got ripped apart and made a bunch of changes, sent it in again. And then by the 3rd one, now this is the 3rd revision that we had done. And at this point, usually you get 3 reviewers. At this point, we had 5 reviewers. And this is actually one of the people who was one of the prime theoreticians for the situative perspective. And thank you for the hard work you invested in revising your paper. I am truly sorry to say, however, that I am not convinced you achieved the result that you hoped for. The first round of review, I recommended your article for revision and resubmission because of its apparent potential to say something new and important, perhaps even to lead to a turnabout in our thinking about learning. Okay, so far so good, but I was already pretty sad right there. I definitely share your belief that complexity theory can make an important contribution to our understanding of learning. While revising the original version of your paper, I had hoped many of its weaknesses would disappear if you compromise on a slightly less ambitious and still very important and difficult target. Now, why would he say that? Well, we were essentially saying our complex systems framework of learning was above his theory, that there were things incomplete in his theory that our framework accounted for. So the less ambitious thing, that's really what he's referring to. Indeed, rather than try to reconcile competing approaches, you might have simply presented the theory and explained how it can work for us in research on learning. This would have required answering the question of how this new outlook accommodates our former ideas of learning. And yet, the difference between the proposed way of organizing the presentation and the one that you chose, I memorized it, and the one that you chose would be what is being foreground and what is relegated to the background. You decided against my proposal, you decided to go on foregrounding the claim that complexity theory can serve as a meta-theory, an umbrella from which every existing theory of learning can find its place. This move, I feel, has shortcomings, and it goes on a little bit more. So this is a pretty big shot person, and he spent a lot of time on the review. It was a long review. signed his name. Most people don't do that. But the other 4 people recommended accepting the paper. One of the other people was one of his former students, although I don't know the other person's name. But you see, they're going after particular ideas. They're really looking at the logic, the rationale, the implications. And that's my take on this, really. I was kind of surprised, actually, that the editor selected this individual, because there was a clear conflict of interest. I mean, it was his baby that we were saying, not that it was ugly, but it wasn't the most beautiful baby, you know, pretty good looking baby. So I don't know if it's a little bit of that. But the other reviews, and that process, going through 3 really bruising things and then really forcing us to push the ideas and so on, was quite an experience. But, that we received the award was completely unexpected to me. We actually, Manu Kapoor, and Peter Ryman and myself, what we elected to do with this is to say, okay, well, we're making some big claims about theories, because essentially the theorizing, I would suggest that the issues of theory that we deal with in this paper apply to research, all educational research that is currently being done. You're using quantitative approaches and using qualitative approaches. You're using more individual looking, or you're looking at groups. The implications of the theorizing in our framework, I would suggest, have implications for the entire field. And that is one of the reasons why I think we received the award. We were tackling a big issue, not necessarily that everybody agreed, but that we were tackling a big issue for the field. Now, what we decided to do is to put together a symposium for the International Conference of the Learning Sciences. Actually, we did it for American Educational Research Association. It was basically kind of to take our paper, get a little summary of it, and then we invited researchers that represent the cognitive and situative, and we also got kind of an embodied cognition person on board to kind of say, well, does this framework help with the theorizing that you use and that you do? Does it contribute something that maybe is lacking? Maybe it doesn't. And so we've asked each to do that, and then we'll kind of, we'll have a discussion. AERA rejected the symposium. We submitted it to the Learning Sciences Special Interest Group, and we made just a couple of very minor revisions, and then submitted it to the Learning Sciences Conference, the biggest one, the International Conference of the Learning Sciences, and then it got accepted. So I kind of feel that maybe Manu Kapoor and Peter Ryman and myself, we might wear shirts that we have a bullseye on the back, because everybody's going to be shooting shooting arrows at us, because we're calling everybody's baby pretty, but a little bit lacking somehow. So we'll see how that goes. I do want to end with this story, which I included in the paper. The story of the drunk in the streetlight. Okay, so it's night, and there's a drunk on his hands and knees. He's underneath the streetlight. And a passerby stops and says, "What are you doing?" And the drunk says, "I'm hunting for my glasses." And the passerby said, "But sir, they're not here. Where did you lose them?" He says, "Over there in the dark alley." "But why are you looking here?" "I can't see in the dark alley." Now, for me anyway, the streetlights are our theories and our methods. They're how we can shine light on the research questions, the issues that we want to be exploring, that we think they're important, that we think might make a difference to the world. And research is the act of actually, I would say, trying to have some courage to go over to the dark alley, not to necessarily just stay where the methods and theories are. See if we can be expanding our theories, maybe expanding the methodological approaches that we're using. And publications, of course, is where we let folks know what we found out, hopefully giving them a little more insight about that dark alley. So kind of in concluding, you know, my first paper, I actually don't have the courage to go look at my first paper I had published now that I've been talking about research questions, because I think I would just be in shame, so I couldn't go quite go there. Besides, I don't have a copy of it anymore. It really doesn't get easier, I don't think, as one goes through their career to get things published. Reviewers are always going to be tough, and you're always going to have to make changes, and that's fine. You know, perhaps you get a tougher skin. But I will say, and I really believe this, since we started talking about research questions, that you're going to do about the same amount of work on a boring research question as an interesting one. So to really take care at this point in your careers, or at any point where you're doing research, about that framing, because then as you go through the process, you have a much higher probability of being able to see better in that alley, to make a contribution that's new and that could be important and helpful to people. So good luck with your questions.